I'm going to give you a fast talk about even faster web fonts, talking about typographic magic, an exploration of performance and expression with type. I work on the design system at Chewy, and I've been working with web fonts for about 15 years, speaking about them all over the world and writing a book and generally carrying on about it way more than most people ever really want to hear. So what can we do with this to overcome some of the no's that we hear all the time in engineering when it comes to wanting to add fonts to the site? So apart from design being important, performance is the first visible aspect of design. So we want to make sure that we give browsers a good map and directions to go and find stuff so we can get stuff on the page quickly. Now, that's going to be things like DNS loading hints, font optimization, fallback tuning, and we don't want to forget about the basics like image attributes and loading priority. So here's our page, and we've got a little bit of stuff that we can take a look at here. We've got some product cards. We've got a few different photographs of Leo and Henry. And as we start to take a look, we've got our fonts loading from Google. And we just pasted in a line of code and moved on. Now, that looks maybe not too bad. Largest contentful paint, 1.035, 0.021 for cumulative layout shift. Now, take a look at this waterfall down below. You'll note this line down around line 11. That's the fonts loading. And until we get those fonts, there's the CSS first. So you can see that's 300 milliseconds just to make the response for the CSS, and then we've got to load the font assets. So we're way out around a second before we can start really putting stuff on screen and having the design come to life. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement. And so we want to make sure we are prepared. So when I talk about we've got a few different things that we can do. And that's going to include pre-connect, preload, and prefetch. So what do we mean by this? Pre-connecting warms up the connection, makes it faster to load those resources, and then just ask for them when we need them. So we're kind of warming up that directions on the map. And then for things that we know we want to have before we start rendering the page, we'll load our basic CSS. And we're setting the fetch priority to high as well. So we're doing everything we can to tell the browser that these are the most important assets to load before we can start processing and rendering the page. We can also do this with a font. So we'll just get one of them. If you're using static fonts, I would load the regular weight. In this case, we're loading a variable font, which I'll talk more about in a moment. Now, we want to do this sparingly, so that's why we don't load too many files, but because this will block the rendering of the page. So keep note of that. You want to make sure that you're doing this wisely. And then for things that you don't need right away, but you know you will need, you can use prefetch. Prefetch is sort of in the middle. It uses that warm connection to ask for a resource, but it'll get it when it can. Now, as we're going about optimizing, we want to make sure we're doing this wisely. We're looking at starting with Google Fonts, and then we're going to optimize them and load them ourselves, and think about maybe loading variable fonts instead. And if you take a look at this waterfall, you can see that the circles up top, it stretches out the amount of time it takes to go get those assets, where if you look at the one below, that tiny little circle right there is the loading of the first font file when we're self-hosting, and then the prefetch is the one that it goes and grabs later that it doesn't need right away. We're also going to make sure that we're using font display swap, and that means the browser can go ahead and render it in the fallback font right away and then switch it over to the web font once it loads. Most of the time, you won't even really see that if we're using these other techniques. But we can also tune up our fallbacks. So this is a neat little trick, and I've got a link to a resource for you with this as well that we'll share later. And then you can have the fallback fonts more closely match the metrics of what you're putting on the screen, so there's less visible change. Now, visible change, we'll also get into that quite a bit by the fact that I just using a variable font instead of a static one. Nonito Sans has 4 different axes to play with. I could explain everything on the screen here, but I know it's always better to show rather than tell. So we'll bring Leo and Henry back, and they'll give us a hand. So these different axes are built into the font file itself. They're not distortions. They're whatever the typeface designer decided to expose. And so we can get things like width, weight, even X height. And of course, we're going to bring Tristan and Tilly back here to illustrate slant. Now, all of these are available just with CSS once we've loaded that file, so we can get way more expressive than the typical, here's 2 or 3 weights of a font, that's it, don't ask us for anything else. And then finally, we don't want to forget about optimizing image formats. We'll get WebP when we can. We always want to specify the width and height so that we can tell the browser how much space to preserve. The important thing there is the aspect ratio. It doesn't actually have to be exact to the size that you are displaying it. They could just be the original dimensions, so you always know what they are. And we're saying fetch priority high for the first asset, so we get that loaded quickly, and then loading lazy for the one down at the bottom of the page, because we know that's nowhere near the viewport just yet. Now, where does this get us after we've done all of this? Well, we've cut our largest contentful paint almost in half. We've dramatically reduced our cumulative layout shift. Total blocking time is again still 0. And when we look at the waterfall here, the fonts are loaded and we can start rendering content on the page over half a second sooner in the right fonts. So there's a tremendous improvement that we've made here without really doing anything other than reorder the way we load things. And now we can get way more expressive and have some fun. So we can play around with all kinds of things to be more responsive. On the small screen, we're keeping the text a little bit tighter. It's not quite as big. It's not quite as open, which is fine because it's a small screen. We don't need that. It's still perfectly legible, and you can fit a little bit more content on the screen this way. We're using clamp to fluidly scale the font size. We're using media queries to set the font width so it's a little narrower on the small screen so we fit more content on a line. And then we're tailoring the font weight for regular and bold so that it works really well with this typeface in the design, and even tweaking it a little bit more when we get to dark mode. So you can see what happens here as we scale to the larger screen. We've opened up the line height. We've increased the font size just a little bit. It's more appropriate for the space that we have. And then again with dark mode, we've lowered the weight a tiny little bit so that as you get into that reverse contrast, the text doesn't fatten up a little bit and get a little bit less readable. I've also used the new light dark syntax to set this up too, which was pretty neat. It really cut down on the amount of CSS that I had to write. Now, since type is the clothes our words wear, we want to not stop at just getting things on screen. We really want to ramp up our expressiveness and take advantage of what CSS has to offer. So we're going to look at things like leveraging writing modes. Sometimes we want a little bit of visual friction to slow people down to take in a message. We also want to balance our text a little bit. So again, we've got a new property, text wrap balance, add one line, and all of a sudden we can start to even those things out and have a few fewer widows and orphans in our text without ever having to go back and resort to any hacks or workarounds. And it even works in longer passages of text. It'll work with up to 4 lines in Chrome. Safari is actually able to do the whole page. So again, 1 line of CSS, everything balances out. It works perfectly in the context of a CMS because you don't really have to add any special markup. It's really pretty great. And if you do want to make sure that you're supporting older browsers that don't have full support for text wrap balance yet, you can actually use feature detection and then layer in hyphenation. So that actually is something that's been supported for quite some time, and you wouldn't have any concerns about putting that in. So we started with static fonts. We added a whole bunch more expressive flair. We ended up with something that is much more interesting and really engaging. It's still very sustainable, and by the numbers, we've made incredible improvements in performance even when we have ended up adding a little bit to the download. So even with all of that we've done, we've made it way more interesting, way more sustainable, a lot more performant, and we're still able to carry on and do exactly what we want to do and have a much more engaging site. So have some fun, and thank you very much. Slides and everything else will be available up at the link that you see here.